going to talk about fire streams a little bit tonight. We're going to do some practical application hopefully on Saturday. I'm still working out some details of that, whether we're going to go to a retention pond and help drain it down a little bit, or if we're going to go off the municipal supply. So we have a little bit of our image to protect too, so if we flow water out of the municipal supply onto the ground, I think we'll probably not have favorable outcomes. So we'll hopefully pump from a retention pond and have a place to flow a little bit of water into a proper drain anyways, and we'll go from there. So
Go help Sioux Falls out.
yeah. Well, we got a couple spots around here that are flooded and water over the road, so I'm hoping we
Yeah,
can
we were
draw that.
bagging some over Wallingford yesterday.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about fire streams a little bit tonight as well. So the first thing we have to talk about though is vaporization and steam and how it relates to the extinguishing properties of water. So why do you think we use water?
Absorbs a lot of energy.
It absorbs a lot of
Readily
energy.
available.
Readily available. Yeah, that's all the basics that you need there.
It's good for you.
What's that?
It's good for you.
Yeah. So a couple of them that are listed out there, readily available, relatively inexpensive, high specific heat, high latent heat of vaporization, and you can apply it in a variety of ways. And we'll talk about those, and I've got some videos to share with you so we don't have to sit through the whole thing just as a lecture anyways, but I'll show you some examples of that as well. So, little science, little math in here too. So they talk about the energy required to change the state of water. One thing they talk about is specific heat, which is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a substance by 1 degree. And they call that, we measure that by British thermal units, or BTUs. So that's what they talk about for specific heat. The latent heat of vaporization, that's the amount of heat required to convert a unit mass of a liquid into a vapor without a temperature change. And they say that you can convert water to steam with 970 British thermal units is basically what they're talking about there. Now, one other thing that they talk about in your book, and I can't explain it a lot better, but is the fact that the temperature may not change when you're producing more steam or the temperature of the fire and the water may not change to turn to steam, but it's going to take more energy. So if it's at 212 degrees, it's going to stay at 212 degrees when it turns to steam, but it's going to take more BTUs or more of that energy to get that conversion to happen. I don't have a good way to explain it. Anybody have a good way to explain that?
Whenever matter changes state, there's
Energy.
right. The temperature doesn't change with the energy.
It takes more energy to do that.
Heat of transformation.
Yeah. So, and that comes into play, so I hate to make it too simple, but big fire needs big water, is what it comes down to. That's what we talked about it. And we've seen it work before. We had a fully engulfed apartment. Instead of putting an 1 3/4 line in to put out that fire, we put a 2.5 inch line. We darkened it down and we got it put out a lot faster. If I'd said to drop an 1 3/4 or 1.5 inch line to put that fire out, we'd have had to use a lot more water and it'd taken a lot more time to extinguish that fire, because we wouldn't have been able to convert that energy that we were using into as much steam as we go anyways. Hopefully that makes sense anyways. So when you do convert that, the heat at 212 degrees and the gallon of water will actually convert to 1,700 gallons of steam essentially. So it expands that much with 1 gallon of water. So you have to also think about it and be careful with it when you vaporize or change that water, how much water you're using to put out that fire. Because you can go from a tenable environment where you can survive that, and you can actually flip the steam around. If you use too much water on too much heat, you can actually bring that steam bank down on top of you, and you can burn the firefighters in that room. If it's all in a contained room, you can flip that room on you. Instead of that steam staying up high where it's supposed to be with that water, if you go in there and you open that line for too long and you put too much steam in there, you can actually bank that smoke, bank that heat, and bank that water down on firefighters, and you can burn them. Because steam's going to burn you more than just the latent heat from the smoke and the gases that are occurring in that fire. and hopefully when we get to the videos, actually I think I get to them next here, I'm gonna show you a couple of videos that can show that. Now, we'll talk about the one video, cause he talks about straight or smooth bore versus a fog stream. And his concept is okay, but his commentary, depending on who you ask, is wrong. But I wanna still show you the difference in the two anyways, real quick, so. Give me just a minute here and we'll.
Yeah, we'll have to switch it over, Chris.
What's that? No, sorry.
I was like, what are you watching up there?
Yeah.
They maintain visibility, everything's still good, if anybody's alive in here on the ground floor, they got good work, guys.
Alright, well, then we'll change it over and cast it then. Sorry. Technology.
You got good fire, go get it.
So that's a smooth bore nozzle.
Visibility, everything's still good, if anybody's alive in here on the ground floor,
See
they
how the
got
fog
good work,
bank
guys.
was?
You got it on 30 degree? Fog it, hit it. Watch the thermal balance drop to the floor, anybody inside just got in the middle of that smoke. Good work, guys. It ought to be obvious for anybody to see. You drop that thermal bounce to that fog nozzle, anybody on that floor is in bad shape right now.
So look at the dark color of the smoke, so it's burning off the fuels on the inside of the structure. He hits it, he's hitting it now. And you see some of the white steam coming out, the conversion. But look at the size of the line he's got. It's a 1-inch line.
Wow.
Might as well be pissing on it.
Yeah. trailer is gonna crack the door open and flow the same amount of time. You can see some dark in there, but you can also see the white steam. Sorry, 33 seconds versus 13, so 4 gallons versus 10. Lights are coming back on here. Alright, so the first video we saw was just the smoothbore versus the fog pattern. And while he touts the smoothbore versus the fog pattern as being a better method, you can see that the steam didn't bank down as much. The fog pattern can be pretty effective too if it's used correctly. So it's not a matter of smooth versus a fog pattern, it's a matter of how much application that you use on a smooth versus how much application you use on a fog. You can do that with either nozzle. You can make that smoothbore, bank it down to the floor if you flow it for too long, and you can make that fog pattern stay up higher like the smoothbore one if you use shorter burst on the flow. So it's going to come down a lot to when we get the burn trailer up here, or when Russ gets that up here, play with that. Do a straight stream hit on it. See what happens with your steam as your heat builds up in those rooms. Get a fog pattern. Put a little fog pattern on it, but just do short burst to see how it does, and then do a long burst, and you'll flip the steam down on top of you. That's the time to practice with those things and see the different reactions that you have. So it's going to come down to your department and what your standard is, or what you're going to use for that fire attack. Used to be in the day that you'd go to 30-degree fog pattern, you'd go into an enclosed structure, you'd open that 30-degree fog pattern, you'd give it a couple of swirls around, and you'd shut it off. And then you let it steam off of that, and then typically it darkened the conditions down as much as you can. With the new stuff out there, the slicers that they're training on for viability, if you may have a victim inside a structure, they're saying, I believe, hit it with a smoothbore or a straight stream, pour the water in there, get that fire darkened down, and then you can go in and go after it. It makes it more viable for your victims as you go down there. That's the latest and newest training that's out there for the slicers training. So it's going to come down to what your department typically uses. I'm not going to tout smoothbore versus automatic nozzles. I personally have always used the automatic nozzles. I haven't used a smoothbore on an interior attack, but I think they're both effective. And it depends on culture and what your department typically uses to put out that fire. And I'm not going to say one's better or worse than the other. Just if you go to use one versus the other, know how it's going to react with a fire, and be prepared for that, and know that you've got to flow this much on a smoothbore and this much if you do a fog pattern with an automatic nozzle. Okay, so that's all I'm going to tout on it. Because if you look on page 947 in your book, in that yellow box in there, they give you a couple of examples involving a fire. And they say it's in a 10 by 20 foot compartment with a 10-foot ceiling, providing a total volume of 2,000 feet. Hot layer of smoke and fire gases is 5 feet deep and has an average temperature of 932 degrees Fahrenheit. In example 1, they say the nozzle operator uses a straight stream or narrow fog pattern to discharge sufficient water upward toward the ceiling to lower the temperature in the compartment to 392 degrees Fahrenheit. The straight stream or narrow fog pattern causes most of the water to reach the ceiling, and if only 10% of the water is vaporized in the hot upper layer and 90% is vaporized on contact with the hot ceiling surface, the volume of the upper layer will almost double, filling the room with hot smoke, fire gases, and steam. In example 2, they say that the nozzle operator uses a fog nozzle set on a wider pattern and applies the same volume of water as in example 1 using short pulses of water fog, lowering the temperature in the compartment to 392 degrees Fahrenheit. However, in that case, 40% of the water is vaporized in the upper layer of the hot gases, and 60% is vaporized on contact with the hot ceiling surface, and that results in a slight decrease in the volume of the upper layer comprised of hot smoke, fire gases, and steam. So there's a couple different ideas there. One in the video with the straight versus the fog, and then the one in the book about the straight versus the fog. Again, it all comes down to application. Knowing your fire, when it starts to darken down, let off on that water, because you know the expansion is that 1 gallon to that 1,700, and that drives home, knowing that that steam's gonna expand, and if you get too much water application on that, too much heat, you're gonna cause a problem for yourself in that compartment. You're gonna flip that room on yourself. And that's gonna cause injury and harm to yourself. Okay, does that make sense and more of a practical application then? Okay. And I'm not gonna tell you fog or straight's the way to go.
Well, the
But-
difference
Just-
was, he was shooting fog at a fire.
Right.
Too, and not trying to cool the room off.
And he kept a long flow in that video. If he did a short burst, he'd had the same, I believe he had the same results as the straight stream probably. So,
Well, like that one, he's more trying to just put out the fire quickly, where dumping a ton of water on it quickly gives the fire less opportunity to like vaporize all that, because there's more. I mean, it takes more to heat a ton of water than
Right.
it does to have it already misted out and
yes,
warmed up.
Yep.
So I mean, yeah, it just took longer, and I mean, converted more of that water to steam when it was in that fog pattern, filling up the room.
yep, exactly. Yep. So that's the basic properties of steam as you go through it and you think about it as you're applying it in a fire situation. And again, it's hard to understand the flow or to teach you flow without getting in a hot room that's got some temperature built up to it and opening a fire stream on it. And so hopefully we'll get that trailer up here, the weather gets nice enough and we can do that before the end. If not, I know that that trailer's available at fire schools and different things. Take your chance and get in there when it's a controlled environment to do that and learn from, get in and train in there. And that'll help you out a lot to understand that, so. All right. Factors that create pressure loss or gain. I know you were all told there wouldn't be math. There is. So the principles of friction loss will impact water pressure on the seam. And that's true because you'll have what we call the engine pressure, which is what shows up on the gauge up here. That's what we're pumping from the pump in the engine. Then as you go through the line, you'll have friction loss depending on several factors we'll talk about here in a minute. But by the time you get to the nozzle, you're gonna have a lot less pressure than what's at the engine pressure as you go through there. And so it depends on a lot of different factors, which I think are included in the slides here. If not, we'll talk about them a little bit more. But and you got to kind of, if it's not only important that you know it if you're on the nozzle, but if you're going to be an operator, a pump operator at all, that you know that, understand this concept very well as well, because you can make a big difference on immediate response. So some things that affect or impact friction loss are practical limits to the velocity of water in a hose line. Just because you add more pressure doesn't mean it's necessarily going to put more volume out there. There are limits. You can crank up the pressure all you want, but if I'm flowing a nozzle that's designed to flow 100 psi and I'm got it pushed up so it's cranking out 150 or 175, it's not gonna flow any more water. It's actually gonna flow less water at a higher pressure. Because its maximum design is 100 PSI to flow out. Okay, and that's a big misconception in firefighters is, oh, I gotta have more pressure, I'll get more water on it. That's not true. If you have the right amount of pressure at the nozzle that you're flowing, you'll get your max gallonage per minute to flow out of the end of that hose line. Hose size and length of the hose lay is definitely, the longer a stretch you have, the more friction loss or pressure loss you have throughout that hose line. Hose size makes a big difference. And we'll talk about those numbers here in just a minute, but an 1 3/4 has probably, your 1 inch has the most friction loss, your 1 3/4 is next, obviously 2.5 is even less, and then by the time you get to your 5-inch supply line, there's virtually no friction loss unless you have an extreme distance in that line. So yeah, some of those things you have to think about. Rough linings and fire hose. As the fire hose gets older, those linings start to break down on the inside of these and can create bumps and different things that will slow the water down as it flows through there. Okay. Number of adapters. So the more adapters you go through, the more things that it has to run through, the more friction gets put on there. Okay, the different sizes and different things that you go through in there. Then the sharp bends in the hose. That's why you'll see firefighters that have been doing this for a while, they'll go along and they'll straighten out those bends in the fire hose, because that reduces your friction loss. Even a half bend in a fire hose or a partial bend can significantly drop the pressure at the end of the line. Damaged hose couplings can cause a friction loss problem for you. We talked about the length of the hose lay, and of course then we just already talked about the diameter of the hose, all being things that will impact friction loss as you go. Some things that you can use to overcome or reduce friction loss, obviously increasing the hose size will reduce friction loss. Additional parallel hose lines. So we talked about the fire hydrants, and there's 2 2.5 that come off of those. If we take 2 10-foot sections of 2.5, loop it around to a Siamese, and then hook it up to our large diameter hose, we're going to have less friction loss and bigger flow out of that hydrant than if we just do 1 2.5 off of there, obviously. And it's going to reduce friction loss because we've only got 10 foot of that 2.5 into either side here, as opposed to 2 50-foot sections. So we only got 10 foot for friction loss in each one, and then we go to that LDH, which is virtually no friction loss. And so we're going to have pretty good flow, or the best flow that we can out of that hydrant. Because you have to have that 10 foot to make enough of a loop to not bend the hose, and then hook into your large diameter hose from there. So that's why we have those short hoses on our 2 main trucks. We have 2 10-foot sections of 2.5, so if that's the only hydrant we got, we can take both, hook both of them, loop it around to this appliance, hook the LDH up, and then we've got a very good water supply with minimal friction loss from there. So that's one of the things that you got to think about. Increasing pump pressure to an extent will increase your nozzle pressure, but it has to be within reason. You have to kind of do that math in your head as you go through there. And then of course some other things that you can reduce it by is taking out kinks, sharp bends, and hose lines. That will help you with your friction loss as you go through there. Elevation. There's a difference in elevation between the nozzle and the pumping apparatus that causes a higher pressure on lower levels and less pressure on higher levels. So here's the worksheet that we put together for the aerial. And this is to help pump operators because, like I said, somebody told me there wouldn't be math, so I made life easier for us when we're running the ladder to determine what kind of friction loss that we're going to have. And then I also figured out that what we needed for our engine pressure to flow, what we needed to flow for gallons per minute. So if you want 1,000 gallons per minute, that bottom chart, and the engine pressure is set at 80, then the flow, the friction loss, excuse me, will be 95. So you have a total of 175 that you'd have to start with for your engine pressure if you want to flow 1,000 gallons a minute, and then you have to figure in the height of the ladder. And to do that, you divide the height in feet by half. So if the ladder's at 60 feet, we have to account for 30 PSI. So I'd have to run the engine at 205 PSI to get 1,000 gallons a minute. Make sense? As you go through the chart there? Okay? And so on and so forth, depending on what you need for flow. Now, flow rates will come in here in a little bit. We'll talk about that when we, shortly here, but what you'll need for a flow rate as you go from there. So even if they're just on a second story, you're going to have some friction loss. So let's say they're on a second story. Let's say it's 20 feet up for whatever reason. They're on the side of a hill or something too. So you're going up 20 feet. That's 10 PSI that you're losing just going up the hill there in friction loss. Then you have to figure out the length of the hose, the size or diameter of the hose, and all those things to be able to set your engine pressure to determine what the nozzle pressure is going to be. So if you need the nozzle pressure at 100, well, you already got to increase it if they're 20 feet in the air by 10, so you got to set the engine pressure at 110, and then you have to figure in the length of the hose and the size of the hose to figure out the rest of the friction loss of what to put the pressure at to get that 100 PSI at the end of the nozzle. Make sense? Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. So Iowa actually had a big hand in initial fire studies, and in 1957, the Iowa formula came out for figuring out how much water you needed to put out a fire in a certain size compartment. And it's still used today. 1957, Iowa State University put out the fire flow plan, or the fire plan, for how to figure out how much water you might need for a certain size room. And so this handout has that. It's on the back is the Iowa formula. And that's for size of the room, but I wanted to talk about some of the stuff on the front real quick here first, but I just thought I'd tell you that the Iowa formula is there. So they talk about some hints or some points in here that kind of fit the chapter that we're talking about tonight, but what's the best size for an attack line? So you have to figure out what factors are highest priority. Maximum flow, maximum mobility, speed, how fast and how much, ease of deployment and pickup, personnel available, and water supply available are things that you need to think about for your attack line. Larger attack hose lines, so what they're talking about, typical attack line is either 1.5 inches or 1 3/4 inches. The reason we went to the 1 3/4 inches, it used to be all 1.5 inches, but the reason they went to 1 3/4 inches is to reduce friction loss. So that's why they increased that little bit, but it does make a difference in the friction loss as you go through there. What they're talking about with larger attack lines would be 2.5 inches. So you have a higher initial attack flow capability, less friction loss. You can lay a lot more hose down, and you can use more of the pump's capacity with that. And then you can kind of see, what higher flows equal. And then there's a rule of thumb for friction loss for hose. So 1 3/4 inch hose, there's 30 pounds of friction loss per 100 foot. What's your first truck's stretch on the cross lay? Do you know?
150?
What's that?
Isn't it 150?
Ours?
Yeah.
Yep, I think we have 150 and I think we have a 200. So do you know what yours is? About the same probably?
Yeah, I think we got three, yeah, it's 150, because we got 3 hoses, 3 foot, 50 foot, 2.5 inch hoses.
Okay, for 2.5, yeah. What's your 1 3/4 or 1.5 inches? About the same, 150 or 200?
200.
Yeah, I'd say probably 200. We may have 200 and 250, Lance, actually, I think, on the engine anyways. So let's just go with 200 on 1 3/4 inches. You lose 30 pounds of friction loss per 100 feet. So 60 pounds we lose. So we got the 10 pounds we've got to add for the 20-foot elevation. We got 200 foot of hose out, so that's 60 pounds. So that's 70 pounds, and we want 100 at a nozzle. That means we set our engine pressure at 170 to make it 100 at the nozzle. That's quite a bit of pressure at 100 at the nozzle. Okay? So, but that's supposed to account for that friction loss, but you can adjust it too. That's the ideal pressure that you should be operating at to, and it seems like a lot as a pump operator for me to crank it up to 170 for you to run a hand line. Typically I'm at 125, 130, 140. So with friction loss and everything else, we're probably more in that 80 to 90 pressure range at the nozzle for the nozzle reaction. So your 2.5 inch is 10 pounds of friction loss per 100 foot. And then your optimal fog nozzle pressure is 100 psi, and your solid bore nozzle, which I agree with and is in your handout or in your presentation here a little bit later, but typically if you're using a smooth bore, you can use less pressure. You can use 50 to 65 psi for a smooth bore nozzle, and you want to use right at that 100 for the fog or the adjustable nozzle as it goes. So, and all that's on here. There's the National Fire Academy formula for quick size up, and they talk about fire knockdown and taking the length times the width divided by 3. So if you have that 10 by 20 room or whatever they have in your book anyways for an example, then you'd have to do that, and that's the gallons per minute that you would need to flow to put that fire out. Okay, the Iowa formulas on the back is length times width times height divided by 100. And they say fire knockdown in 60 seconds in an enclosed area. And basically they're not saying you're gonna pull up and you go, okay, I got this size room and I got this much fire. You're not gonna take the time to do that, but what they want you to be thinking about is if it's an average size room in a house and it's fully engulfed, I'm gonna need roughly this gallon per minute. Or for pre-planning someplace, I've got this size room. For example, gymnasium. Length times width times height divided by 100. This is how much gallons per minute I'm going to have to flow for this particular building. And then you have to take in other factors. Is it sprinkled? What's the access points? Different things like that. So that's what this handout's basically about. I just wanted to add a little more information to you and hopefully kind of explain why it's important to understand fire flows and understand friction loss for optimal operation pressures at the nozzle anyways. So, okay? Water hammer, don't do it. Okay? Slow to open, slow to close on the nozzle. You'll get the ire of a pump operator pretty fast if you water hammer their truck. A lot of them treat them like they're babies. Okay? So it's a shock wave that's produced by basically suddenly shutting off that pressure on the end of that line. And it can cause some pretty significant damage to fire trucks and their pumps if they're not ready for it. They do have safety devices in place. There's that stainless steel wheel on there. It's typically not set by volunteer fire departments, but that's set to take that pressure. If somebody water hammers that, that's designed to open as a valve or a relief so that that pressure will dump down to the ground. But it's typically not set correctly. But that's what that wheel's there for. You turn it till it opens, the little yellow light turns on, then you crank it back a couple turns, and that's what it's designed for. If somebody water hammers the truck, that valve's supposed to open up on the pump and not allow that water hammer to occur. But again, there's so many things going on in a pump operator's mind, that's not the first thing they're gonna set. So try not to water hammer it if you can. Close slowly, okay? Take your time to shut it off. There's actually in most nozzles, some of them are just smooth. I know all of our new ones, they have clicks. Okay, so if you go to shut it off, I usually just listen for the click or feel for the click and just shut it off, click at a time. I just take my time shutting it off. Same with opening it up. Okay, and slam it back, you're gonna have that full pressure, and that pump may not be as reactive as you are when you open it, because most of the pumps are automated now. It's gonna go, oh, I gotta ramp up pressure. So you open it up and you may get that starting pressure of whatever the truck's set at, but as that RPM ramps up, it's gonna give you more pressure as you go and open it up. If you open it slowly, you give that truck some reaction time, and it's gonna open up and you're gonna be able to handle that pressure a lot better. So nice and slow closing, nice and slow opening, and it'll save you from going flying. Or getting yelled at for creating a water hammer. Okay? Fire stream patterns and limiting factors. There's lots of things that can limit how far your fire stream can go and where you want to get it applied to. Things like the velocity of the water coming out. Gravity is a factor on there. Wind direction and velocity. Northwest Iowa, we don't have any wind, right? So wind blowing around at all. Air friction, operating pressure, nozzle design and adjustments, and condition of the nozzle opening. So all of those things can affect that. That can be as simple as what size smoothbore you have running out of there. Okay, this can make a longer distance, you take one off, you can lose a few feet of distance as you go. As you bring the size down, you'll have a bigger volume coming out of there, but it's gonna decrease the amount of, a distance that you're able to reach. Okay, could be as simple as that. Could be a crudded up nozzle that can affect that. Could be the design of the nozzle that limits that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. So there's several things that you're trying to accomplish with your fire stream. Obviously, you want to get the wet stuff on the red stuff. Want to apply it to open flames, burning material, reduce the temperature of the upper layers, disperse hot smoke, fire, and gases. So maybe something where you're trying to ventilate just real quick. You go into a 30-degree fog pattern, go out the window, and you pull the smoke past you. It creates that air to pull that smoke and those hot gases out of the structure for you. Create a water curtain to protect. There used to be devices out there, a lot of homemade ones that worked really, really well. The best one I ever saw was back in my hometown. I don't even know if I was a firefighter yet, but it was the coolest thing I've ever seen. They basically designed a pipe that hooked on the end of a 2.5-inch fire hose, and then somebody meticulously took a chain, welded it to the pipe all the way in a half moon shape over the top of it. They drilled holes in the top of the pipe, so when the water come out, it hit that chain and it dispersed it. And they actually used it on a downtown fire. There was about 3 feet distance between the two buildings in downtown Royal. And they took, and before the fire got too far out of control, had two wooden structures next to each other. They took that 2.5-inch line, run it down in between those buildings, and they started water flow, and this big curtain of water in between barely damaged the building next to it. Total loss on the one that burned down, but the one next to it didn't have hardly any damage because that water curtain made a big difference. So, what's that?
You got a homemade one on there, too?
Yep, there's a lot of homemade ones out there that work pretty well. I don't think anybody that manufactures them has been able to replicate a good homemade one yet, so. But there's a lot of different ones, different things that are out there, so. And then create a barrier between fuel and fire. There's another thing that you can do with your fire streams as you go anyways. There's streams that are described in several ways, whether it's by the pattern they form. So it could be smoothbore, straight stream, whatever you want to call it. It can be an automated nozzle or a fog pattern nozzle. You have penetrating nozzles that have different streams on them. This one has a 90-degree, so when the water comes out the end, it shoots up and hits, and one side comes out straight at 90 degrees across this way, and one's a 45, and so it comes out at a 45-degree angle on this one. This is designed to go through walls or floors, whatever it happened to be up in the attic spaces, and then whatever you do, you can turn it around, and as you turn it back and forth, that 45 goes one way and the 90 goes sideways, and you can use that to put out fire that way too. So there's a lot of different appliances and devices out there that can do that. There's a few different control valves. Most of them have the bail on them though that turns them off and on. And then there's nozzles that create different patterns. And I think they have pictures of those in your books, some funky looking ones that just attach on the end of the hose too that have outlets that go all different directions anyways. So again, the type of nozzle you use will have a different effect on the fire stream. The size of the opening and the nozzle pressure are going to determine how much flow you're going to have out of it. The size of the opening influences the reach or the distance, and the type of the nozzle determines the shape that's going to come out of there. Typically with a smoothbore, you're able to get more distance out of it. With a automated nozzle or a fog type nozzle, you can get close to the straight stream, but not quite as far when you bring that pattern down to a straight stream. It just doesn't go quite as far as the smoothbore does anyways. So, what they talk about is 3 different fire stream patterns. They talk about low volume, and that's typically your 3/4 inch or 1 inch line, and it's about 40 gallons per minute. That's your trash lines, your grass truck lines, the lines kind of like that. Then you have your hand line stream, which is your 40 to 350 gallons a minute, and that can be the 1.5 to the 3 inch line. And then you have master streams. and they're typically set up on your bigger fires. We use that at the Hill Avenue apartment building fire. There's a master stream set, and then we had master streams running off of each ladder. But basically, it's at least a 2.5 to 3 inch line or multiple lines, or I've even seen where they have large diameter hose, the 5 inch or 6 inch hose that comes into those streams that flows that much water out of it. And they're considered a master stream if they're running that. Here's an example kinda of each. So they got the 1 inch booster line here. You can see the flows there. This is your typical probably 1.75 inches, 1.5 flow line, and this is a 2.5 master stream. Typically you can pull it off of the top of the truck and set it down onto an appliance and use it on the ground level, or if it stays on top of the truck, it's still a master stream. Or if it's on the top of a ladder, it can also be considered a master stream.
I think that one there is I was looking at that the other day, a Blitz Fire.
Blitz Fire, yeah.
The name of that one is.
It looks like the TFT Blue, so the same brand that we use, so. Okay. So the volume of water discharge is determined by the nozzle design and the water pressure put to it. We kind of talked about that, the smooth bore versus the automatic nozzles anyways. Again, the more water you can flow on the initial attack, the better chance you're gonna have of extinguishment. We talked about water supply in rural areas. There used to be a thought process for a while that firefighters thought, you know what, if I don't flow as much water, I can make it last longer, and then when my water supply gets here, I can hit it from there. Well, with the slicers and the new stuff coming out, they're saying, no, empty your truck out in that first few minutes on that fire, get that steam conversion going, darken it down, and then you can either get your survivors out or you can go do your mop up afterwards, because if you're conserving water, it's actually gonna create more damage and put out less fire than if you blitz it with more water to start off with as you go. So, different concepts again out there, but that's kind of the idea behind that. So, and we'll talk about the nozzles a little bit more here shortly. The fire stream type is a pattern or shape of the stream that as it leaves the nozzle. Obviously it has to be compact enough for the majority to reach the burning material. It must meet or exceed the critical flow rate to be able to put the fire out. Must have sufficient reach to put the water where it's needed. And types can be any size or classification on the pattern as far as it goes. It can be any of those. To be effective, obviously you have to have a pump, you have to have a hose, you have to have a nozzle, and then you have to have something to come out the end of that nozzle to put the fire out. Okay? Solid stream, there's a picture of that anyways in operation. It's produced from a fixed orifice and a smooth bore nozzle. That's that one. I'll just send the tip of it around anyways. We were using this the other day and it is pretty impressive how far it can shoot. We were shooting the water just around the corner trying to get it to drain to a different spot with the water that we had running over the road, and it was shooting quite a distance. So the solid stream has good reach and stream penetration. You can have a lower nozzle pressure when you're using the straight bore stream. Does produce less steam conversion, less heat absorption per gallon, and the risk that you have is it does have a higher chance of conducting electricity. So those are that's one of the downfalls of using the straight stream anyways. And they say don't use solid streams on energized electrical equipment anyways. Makes it more entertaining, I suppose, but they talk about the range and the breakover point, just making sure that if you're wanting to reach, it might be part of your decision making whether you go with the smooth bore or if you go more with a fog nozzle or maybe just what you use in your department. But typically with a smooth bore you can use 50 or 65 PSI and it holds together pretty good for a little bit longer distance. I know that some places like large tire fires or hazardous waste fires, they'll go to that smooth stream instead of the automated because they can get better reach with the smooth bore nozzle than another one. So Fog stream composition allows it to achieve the desired performance. So water droplets can be created in different patterns that expose the maximum surface area, increases the amount of heat absorbed, and the rate water converts to steam. So that's some of the advantages there. So your book kind of touts the fog stream versus the straight stream for fire extinguishment. Again, it's going to depend on what your department typically uses anyways. So the fog stream characteristics are described by several concepts. The patterns adjust on them. They have several uses. Reduces the heat through water surface exposure. Can cool hot gas layer, hot surfaces. Has a shorter reach and penetration than a solid or straight stream, and it's more affected by the wind. If it's applied incorrectly or used incorrectly, you can disturb that thermal layering, and you can intensify the fire by pushing fresh air into the fire area as well. So the straight bore has some wind that it'll pull with it, but if you do a fog pattern, you actually can pull a lot of wind, and that's actually how you can ventilate some structures, is by using the fog stream or the fog stream nozzles. So fog stream angle and maximum reach are some things that you have to understand there too. You have a narrow angle or wide angle with these nozzles that you can do. Should be 100 PSI as a standard nozzle pressure. And then once you're at that max pressure, you're not going to increase the reach anymore if you add more pressure to it like we talked about earlier. So your standard nozzle, typically as you go to the left, you're going to have more of your straight stream. As you go to the right and open it up, you're going to get fog stream. Now it might be different on your nozzles, just depends. All of them are, but I believe all of them are manufactured this way. And the one thing to know though is you can go too far when you're going to your fog stream, and you can open it up to what they call flush. Okay? And all that does is it opens everything up in here and allows you to flush out any debris or anything that might be in there. It's a good, what's that?
Rinse the foam out.
Yep, rinse the foam out, rinse any debris that you have in there. It's a good way if you're not getting the reach you think you should be, or you're not getting a good fog pattern. So you got a fog going and this side isn't working very good. Slow your flow down, open it up to flush, hopefully get whatever debris in there out, and then you can bring it back to your fog stream or back to your straight stream and adjust it as you go from there. Okay, so there's one of the automated nozzles anyways. On the front of this one too, it allows for lower flow. So if you look at the front of it and you take this, it's on standard. If you don't have that much pressure for whatever reason, you can flip it over and it's in the red, and it's a lower pressure. So you can go at more of a 40 to 50 PSI and still get some flow, but it's going to be less volume. You'll still get the reach and you'll still get what you need out of it, but there'll be less volume of water coming out of it at this point. Okay, just one of the adjustments on this particular nozzle anyways. So
if you've got it knocked down and you don't want to damage
yes,
more water.
Yep, you can decrease the volume to decrease any damage or amount of water that you're using to knock down. That's, yep. Okay.
What's a nozzle like that cost, Chris?
I think they're $350, $400, maybe more. It's been a while since we bought some, so they're expensive. I bet it's more than that. I bet we're close to $700 or $800. Okay, and we talked about that, rotating the shaper. You can have a solid stream or you can do a fog stream with it. We talked a little bit about the specialized nozzles. This one's a it rotates and allows for a water curtain to be established. That's another version of a water curtain anyways. We have the piercing nozzle, so careful with that one. Now this piercing nozzle goes with a specific nozzle on the engine. So we have one that will do a standard fog pattern style like those, and then you can take that fog pattern end off, and it just has the same release that you see on the side of this one, and you can pull that off and put this nozzle on it, so it's easy to switch in and out. Right? So, and then there's other out there that will produce different types of effects varied on what your department might need anyways as you go through there. Typically with the broken streams, they have real coarse droplets. They absorb more heat per gallon than a solid stream. Greater reach and penetration than a fog stream. Can be effective on fires in confined spaces, so that piercing nozzle would be good for that. May have sufficient continuity to conduct electricity, so something that you just have to be aware of. And then sometimes they don't reach far enough to get to some fires, so you have to understand how your appliances work and whether it's gonna work for you on that anyways. Things that can affect how far your fire stream will reach. Gravity we talked about, the velocity of the water coming out, what the pattern is that you're using to spray the water, the water droplet or air friction, and then of course wind is going to affect the factors of how far your fire stream is going to reach. Angle is going to affect it too, and sometimes it's hard to tell when you're flowing, because you think you're flowing and you're hitting the house and you're actually going over the top of the house sometimes, or you're not reaching the fire that you need to. That's where that communication comes in and keeping an eye on it. If you can't see what you're trying to hit, then have somebody walk up and communicate that you're getting to where you want it to be anyways. So that can all be affected by the angle too that you're spraying the water. Okay? Fire stream nozzles, they fall into different categories but all have the same functions. There's a straight tip or the smooth bore that we talked about. Then there's the spray or the fog, which is the second one going around. And then not on the standard is the broken stream devices. And they all do the same thing. They control water flow, create reach, and shape the fire stream as you go through there. So, there's some pictures of the straight stream, different types. We actually have some of this style up on the shelf over at the Arnold's Park Station on demonstration anyways. So,
Chris, on the smoothbore, is there a valve?
yes, typically you'll have it on a nozzle and then on a valve, so. Things like this is designed for our monitor, yep.
Okay.
So you can pull the standard nozzle off and put the straight bore on. We don't have either the ground monitor or for the top mount monitor on the truck. So we don't have any specifically for interior attack.
Okay.
So we use all the fog nozzles for that.
Good, nothing for a hand line then? or
Right, right.
Inch and 3/4.
So
I got to use a smooth bore on a 3-inch line.
yeah.
That was fun.
Well, you can use lower pressures and it's a lot less tiring probably on a.
We were still at like 100.
Yeah. So you're supposed to operate 50 to 65 and still have the same reach and volume.
had-
So
That was on our 4th Street fire, like back in October.
sure.
So we had four lines going. 2 off of one truck. They were on a shared line.
Oh, sure. So it's hard to control then.
So we had 100. They had one of these.
The fog nozzles.
Yeah, and they were upstairs.
Sure.
We had a 3-inch line on the other side of that.
Gotcha.
We had 4 guys trying to hold that line.
I bet you did. So
No handle. It was nice.
makes it fun.
That's right.
Dangerous.
Yes. Okay. The lower nozzle pressures, you can do that. They're less prone to
That's
clog
kinda
with
just
debris. They're one of the things that you can use for applying compressed air foam. So they usually flow a little better with that. The only problem is it may allow your hose lines to kink a little better because you're using lower pressures of that 50 to 65. You can actually kink your hoses a lot easier at that pressure. You wouldn't think that much difference between 50 and 100, but there's a lot of difference, and you can kink off hoses pretty easy at 50 to 65 psi anyways. And then it doesn't allow for selection of different stream patterns. That's one of the things I like about the fog nozzle is if the fecal matter hits the oscillating wind mover and you need to protect yourself for some reason, you can go to that 30 degree or open that fog up a little bit, create a little space for you to work and start backing out of the situation you're in, if you need to anyways. So that's why I like the automated, or the fog nozzles, excuse me. There's two concepts that affect the flow rate of the smoothbore, the velocity of the stream and the size of the nozzle. And the velocity is going to affect the nozzle pressure, and the tips need to be equipped for a certain flow rate. So you have to kind of figure that out as you go, depending on what the tip is at for that anyways. Fog nozzle operation, you can create several patterns using a specific pressure. You can do straight stream, a narrow angle fog, which they usually call a 30-degree fog, and then you can go out to a 45 or wider fog if you need to, or a wide angle fog. And again, it should be operated at that 100 PSI if it's possible to hold on to it, and you have the people that are able to do that anyways. There's several categories of characteristics that fog nozzles fall into. Your discharge pattern can be adjusted, we know that. Can provide protection to firefighters, I just talked about that, I guess I got ahead of my slides, sorry. Can be used in a variety of applications, offer a variety of nozzle choices, and can be used to apply foam. Typically with that, you have to add another appliance or piece on the end to allow the air to be put into there, but then most of them are designed to add on to the end of that pretty easy anyways, or to clip over the end of it. So, several types out there. There's the basic that's just, you open and close it, and you can make it narrow stream or wide stream. Constant gallonage means regardless of what you open it at, it's going to continue to flow. Constant pressure, automatic, that's this one that I handed around. And then the constant or select gallonage, and that would be this one. That is a select gallonage kind of too, because when you flip that front to the low, then that reduces the gallonage. But what they're really talking about with select gallonage is like this 1-inch nozzle that we have. You can flow at 60, 50, 30, or 15 GPM. Okay, so it depends on what you're fighting. This is more for wildland firefighting, things like that. If it's something you want to conserve water on and just still cool the fire, you can go to your 15. Or if you need a little better reach and a little more water, you can go to your 60 as you go through there. So, and that's just on the front. You still have the adjustment on the end that creates your straight and your fog pattern. And then you have your gallonage adjustment that's a little bit further back. Otherwise, the bail's the same, and it's a ball valve to open this one as well. So the manually adjustable fog nozzles allow the rate of discharge to change. You see that it's located behind the nozzle tip. The flow is constant as long as the pressure is present. The operator can make the choice before opening or while flowing. You can actually adjust or reduce down your flow while you're actually operating the nozzle. Rates can depend on the size of the nozzle. It may have a flush setting, which this one does. And then you can make adjustments in small increments based on what your needs are on what you're fighting for the fire anyways.
Can you take 2 seconds?
Sure.